This is the Reason interview with Nick Gillespie. I'm Billy Binion, guest hosting for Nick. Our guest this week is Mark Clifford, former editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post, whose recent book, The Troublemaker, chronicles the life of Jimmy Lai, a man who escaped mainland communist China to Hong Kong as a child and went on to become a self-made billionaire. But now, at age 77, Lai is a political prisoner, currently on trial in China for his unwavering criticism of the government, particularly as it relates to a pro-democracy publication he founded called Apple Daily. Clifford and I talked about Lai's humble beginnings, his cinematic escape to freedom, his fearless pro-democracy activism, his life in prison, where he's been held in solitary confinement, and the importance of safeguarding free expression around the world. And now, to the Reason interview. Mark Clifford, thank you for talking to Reason.
Great to be here.
So I'm just going to start pretty broad. Why do you think people should know Jimmy Lai's name?
Well, he's a genuinely brave, courageous person, one of the most important political prisoners in the world. But beyond that, he's got a historical significance in the sense that nobody in 75 years of Chinese Communist Party rule has stood up to the party as effectively as he has. And so he's become a symbol of resistance in Hong Kong and beyond. And he also helps us see what the Chinese Communist Party intends for free societies. He's showing up the degree to which they've crushed freedom in Hong Kong. We used to be one of the freest places in the world, but the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has crushed that freedom over the past 5 years. And I think this is their plan for Taiwan and beyond. And so Jimmy's resistance, the 1,500 days plus that he spent in jail, mostly in solitary confinement, serve as a kind of showcase of the freedom Hong Kong once had, the courage of this individual, and the degree to which the Chinese Communist Party will go to destroy people and a free society.
So we're going to get to his criminal trial, but to understand why Lai is fighting this fight, I think you have to understand where he came from, which you outline it's a very interesting read in your new book, The Troublemaker. Can you walk us through the contours of his childhood and how he ultimately got to Hong Kong?
Sure. I mean, it's a story that actually sounds so fantastic that if you pitched it as a Hollywood screenplay, it would seem
It really does.
almost.
Truly, it's cinematic.
Yeah, but it's this kind of Horatio Alger, rags to riches story, but it kind of sounds made up, but it's not. He was a twin. He was born 2 years before Mao took power in China in 1947. His father fled to Hong Kong after the revolution, leaving his mother and Jimmy, his twin sister, and an older sister. Mother was in and out of labor camps type penal institutions, leaving these 4 and 6 year olds to fend for themselves during the week. She came home on weekends. Jimmy was a street urchin, a kind of juvenile delinquent, hustling, picking up old cigarette butts and re-rolling the tobacco and selling them, stealing scrap metal and selling it, carrying bags at the Guangzhou railway station. It's there that he met a guy from Hong Kong who gave him a little tip and then a half-eaten chocolate bar, and Jimmy ate the chocolate bar. And this is a time of real hunger in China. It was the so-called Great Leap Forward, which saw something like 45 million. Think about that, 45 million people who died of famine as a result of political decisions by Mao and the Chinese Communist Party. And Jimmy's starving, eats a bite of this chocolate, turns around to the guy, "Wow, what is this? It's chocolate. Where are you from?" "Hong Kong." "I'm going to Hong Kong." And he got permission from his mother to go. He was able to get a one-way permit to Macau, which is a Portuguese colony near where he lived and across the Pearl River Delta from Hong Kong. He's 12 years old. You think of his mother giving him permission to leave. I think she was terrified that her son would die of starvation. He stows away on a smuggling boat. He's saying, becomes one of a million and a half refugees who are flooding into Hong Kong, goes and finds his mother's sister. She's living in a shanty town that's their house is so small, there's not even room for him to sleep on the floor. So she finds him a spot he sleeps on a table in a factory the first night he's there and starts doing odd jobs. Again, he's 12 and a half years old. Within 15 years, he'd already bought a factory. 5 years after that, it's one of the biggest sweater makers in Hong Kong, if not in Asia. Makes his first few millions that way, gets a bit bored with just making sweaters, decides he'll start selling sweaters and shirts, and sets up the original fast fashion retailer, a company called Giordano. Gets bored with that. He's about to go into fast food, and then bam, the Tiananmen Square massacre of June 1989 comes, and Jimmy's whole life takes a different turn. But he was forged in fires that I think none of us can really understand. I mean, the poverty, the political persecution, the humiliation. I mean, he saw people executed on killing grounds in Guangzhou. It was a really, really rough time. And then he comes to Hong Kong. He sees it as a land of freedom. To us, it would look like a place of child labor and exploitation. He loses part of a fingertip in the factory, loses his hearing in one ear. But yeah, he scrambles his way up, as lots and lots and lots of people in Hong Kong did at that time. But it was really the turn towards politics in 1989 that made him from just another one of a thousand multimillionaires in Hong Kong into something much, much more.
I want to briefly go back to something that you mentioned in kind of in passing. His mom was in and out of penal institutions. Can you, for someone who's not familiar, for the listeners who aren't familiar with that era in Chinese history, can you talk about why someone like Jimmy Lai's mom would be targeted like that?
Yeah, she was considered a class enemy. Is ironic because she was his second wife, and she'd been a peasant, raised as a peasant, but she was, I don't know, forcibly or not, married into a family to take care of the first wife's kids, to give more kids for the family. But she was a peasant, right? The family was wealthy enough that the grandfather, Jimmy's grandfather, was reputed to have the first Rolls Royce in Guangdong province, which is a southern province bordering Hong Kong. So it was a rich family, and they had a big house, and they lost everything after the revolution. So Jimmy had half siblings who'd gone to private schools and things, and here he was he's a primary school dropout. He never made it through 6th grade, and his mother was a peasant. But because she had sinned, so to speak, by marrying into a rich family, she was marched off to, Jimmy always called it a labor camp, but to be really precise about it, when you were sent to a labor camp in China, you didn't come home on weekends. She was somehow able to make it home on weekends. But, the point is, it was forced labor. It was slavery. She wasn't free to go take care of her kids at night, right? It was so desperate that she was a great cook, but she would deliberately burn the rice so she could bring some of that burned rice home to her kids. She was forced to, you know, um, go on her knees on ground glass, wear a dunce's cap, bow before jeering mobs because she was seen as a class enemy. Again, the irony is she wasn't even a class enemy. She was born and raised a peasant, but that was China then, right? I mean, there's no rhyme or reason to it, just as there was no rhyme or reason to a great leap forward that killed 45 million people from famine. But this was the China that Jimmy grew up in. This is again, the world that he was forged in. And most people were ground down and destroyed. A few people, to paraphrase Nietzsche's aphorism, what didn't kill them made them stronger. And Jimmy was one of those people. He came out of that with an enormous sense of strength, self-confidence, and optimism. Strangely, I don't think most of us would have reacted that way.
One of the recurring themes in your book is Jimmy's relationship might not be the right word, but how he kind of responded to his dad, who was kind of a ghost of his past, who we never really got to know very well. Can you talk about why someone like Jimmy's dad would have fled to Hong Kong and would not have been able to bring his family, and what that choice was before him?
Yeah, it's interesting you pick up on that. Actually, both parents were given permission to leave, but the cruelty of the Chinese Communist Party being what it was, um, they were told that if they both left, that the children couldn't leave. So if the mother went as well, the kids would have to stay behind. So the mom decided to stay. She endured the punishment that we've just talked about. And Jimmy's father just wanted to get the heck out of Dodge. I think he, in fact, had married into the rich family, had more to lose. Just wanted to leave this, horrible communist hellhole. And the irony was that he and the family had actually supported the communist rebels during their civil war with the nationalist forces who were forced to Taiwan. So here's somebody who's sympathetic to the communists and is just ground up and driven out. And so He wanted to get out. My understanding is that a corrupt local official helped him. They got those permits. And I think Jimmy never talked about it like this, but clearly one of the reasons he wanted to go to Hong Kong was to find his father. And as you point out, this was to some extent an unconsummated, unrequited love or longing. The father died when Jimmy was 19, so about 7 years or so after he got to Hong Kong. They saw each other some, but I think it's telling that the first place he went when he got there was his mother's sister, not to his father's.
So fast forward back to Jimmy is in Hong Kong. He has this political awakening that you mentioned, but it was kind of gradual, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, most people who know him, and I first met him in 1993, kind of a black box before 1989. But I was able to talk to a number of people who knew him in the 70s and 80s and worked with him in the textile business. But by all to most appearances, he was living the life of a crazy rich Asian. He had a pet bear, he had a Rolls Royce, had a big mansion on the hill
Traveling all the
overlooking the
time.
Hong Kong harbor. And yeah, he lived a lived a wild and crazy life. People, some clothed, some not, going in and out of the jacuzzi, weed, lots of women, lots of yeah, it was not your typical Hong Kong life. It was a really sybaritic life, in and out of New York a lot, moved with a fast fashion crowd. He was in the textile business. Um, but he was, by all accounts, really taken by the economic reforms that started under Deng Xiaoping, who was Mao Zedong's successor, in the 1979, 80. But we're really quite embryonic during the 1980s. But Jimmy actually started producing some of his clothes, set up factories across the border from Hong Kong and Shenzhen to take advantage of the cheaper labor. And one person who's known him for 50 years said he was almost like a Zionist in his belief in China's rise and in the economic reforms in China, and thought that political and social change were sure to follow. He'd started reading Hayek, the Austrian free market thinker, economist, philosopher, in the late 1970s, and was a big disciple of the free market movement. Later became friends with Milton Friedman, the again very free market Nobel
Reason
Prize winning
listeners
economist.
will be familiar, I think.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, they traveled around China together. So Jimmy was super optimistic about China, and it's heartbreaking now to see him. We'll talk more about the trial later, but to see him charged with, essentially treason. Somehow
Right.
with undercutting the interests of China. Whereas this is a guy who loves China. He's Chinese through and through. I mean, he's Hong Kong Chinese. He's a Hong Konger, but he wants China to succeed. And so he was really optimistic. As I said, I described him as like a Zionist in terms of his zeal for China's economic reforms. And in the spring of 1989, when the students, hundreds of thousands of students and workers took to the streets in Beijing and, in fact, around China, Jimmy started selling shirts with the student leaders' pictures, faces printed on these T-shirts that he sold at his Giordano retail chain. Sent up over $100,000 to the students in Beijing. Sent up tents and other material, and was really all in with the students. And then I think, as most listeners will know, June 4th, 1989, saw the Chinese government murder hundreds, maybe thousands of students and workers. I mean, really some of the best and the brightest of their generation. And I mean, to me, it was just, completely devastated. And he'd been really impressed by CNN and the coverage he'd seen of Tiananmen. We forget, we're in a really different age now, but the Tiananmen massacre and the events around it, one of the first times that the world was able to watch an event like this unfolding in real
Right.
time. It was still 6 months before the fall, or almost 6 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So Jimmy just thought, wow, media, technology, transparency, this is going to be the end of the Chinese Communist Party. We're going to force them to be accountable. We're going to force them to be modern. We're going to bring them out of this kind of medieval, feudal system that the Chinese Communist Party has set up. So he decided to set up a magazine.
Right. Right. Which brings us to the mid 90s. As you've already talked about, at this point, Jimmy Lai is a wildly successful businessman, one of the richest people in the world. I mean, his net worth at one point was estimated at 1 billion. It's since declined, obviously, since he has not been able to. He's been he's been jailed for several years now. But at one point, one of the richest people in the world. How does he come to say, okay, he could spend his time just making more money, he's more sweaters, more garments. What is his point where he's like, okay, I'm going to funnel my energy toward this pro-democracy cause? He starts this magazine you mentioned called the Apple Daily. So can you walk us through the beginning of that venture?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a great question. And when you look back at these turning points in Jimmy's life, you say, like, why would he do that? I mean, most people, they might have been mad, they might have done some things. They might have started, an NGO organization or something. Not many of them would have said, I'm going to start a whole new business. And when and friends were a little bit dubious, and they said to him, like, "What do you know about media?" And he said, look, I read Time, I read The Economist, I read Fortune magazine. I can do a magazine." I mean, he had again. This gets back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago. He has this incredible self confidence. It's like, if I fail, I fail. That's not how he thinks, but I think he's always ready. If he fails, he picks himself up and does something else again. And pretty much everything he did, every business venture, was a success. There were a few exceptions, as you'd expect, but pretty high record of success. So he first starts this magazine just 9 months in March 1990, less than a year after the Tiananmen killings, and it's got everything in it. It's got the best investigative team that Hong Kong has ever seen. It's pulling the lid off all sorts of cozy dealings between business, government. It's writing about affairs between politicians and other people. It's got stock market coverage. I think it had horse racing coverage. So this was Next Magazine. And then he sets up the newspaper. Excuse me. And that was in 1995. That was Apple Daily. That had the horse racing, even more paparazzi stuff. He had, I think several dozen, maybe 60 or more photographers going around on motorcycles. So if there was an accident, if there was somebody giving birth on the street, as a friend of mine's wife was once, Apple Daily was there before the ambulances were there, before the first responders. So it was like super aggressive, really fun. First color printing for a newspaper in Hong Kong, really bold graphics, fantastic, really accessible, and yet super pro-democracy. And I first met him in 93, so Next Magazine was already going, but it was still a couple of years before Apple was going to start. And he walked me through the whole situation because it seemed a little crazy. It's hard to start a newspaper. Hong Kong is a very, very crowded newspaper and magazine market, still is. And the commies were coming in 2 years. And he's like, look, the Hong Kong people want democracy. The British, still a British colony then, had its first free elections in 1991. Surprising, overwhelming vote for the pan-democratic, small d democratic candidates. And he said, look, this is what people want. I've got a market. Everybody else is afraid. They're pulling out. It's almost like if you were Warren Buffett, who talks about having a moat around your business, a protective moat. Jimmy had a protective moat. He was on on an island that people wanted to be on. And yet, everybody else was, all his competitors were afraid to be on that. So he went from the success of Next to, greater success at Apple. The handover came and went, and he just kept rocking along, as aggressive as ever.
And it was a very pro-democracy stance, correct?
Absolutely. That was always at the heart of who they were. It was almost like the Wall Street Journal: free men, free markets, or free people, I guess the journal says now. It was all about freedom. So I talked to a lot of journalists. I was in media myself. And I was on the board of directors of the newspaper. There was so little censorship. You could pretty much write anything you wanted in that newspaper, but you couldn't write about, like, what he regarded as socialist economics. He had great economists, great stock market commentators, lots of horse racing, had everything. Reviews of bordellos. I mean, it was crazy. He went to the edge of good taste, and sometimes, as he would admit, beyond, and he learned from his mistakes. But at the heart of it was always a pro-freedom, pro-democracy agenda. And the Hong Kong opposition parties were structurally set up as so as to make it basically impossible for them to actually have power, even though they got a majority of votes. So Apple and Next and the whole Jimmy Lai stable became kind of de facto main opposition force. And this became more important after the 1997 Chinese takeover.
Just a sidebar for a moment. Can you talk a little bit about how you two met and forged a
Yeah,
friendship?
sure. I was a journalist in Hong Kong. Well, I moved there in 1992. I've been in South Korea. I was so happy to come to Hong Kong. It was just so free. I mean, Korea was just coming out of this kind of 40 years of military rule, and um, it's just like a breath of fresh air. And people like Jimmy were just so accessible. And called him up, wanted to interview him, and his assistant Samantha said he's kind of retired now. He'll be happy to meet with you. He wants to cook you lunch. I said, or he wants to invite you over for lunch. And I go over and he cooks me lunch, made me a really nice stir fried. And yeah, we just chatted, and that became the beginning of, that was 93. So I've known him for 30 something years now.
So when did this venture of his, this pro-democracy news venture, really start to sour in terms of pressure from the government to back off?
Yeah, well, the pressure from the government, especially the Chinese government, was there almost from the beginning. So I met him in 93. In 94, he wrote, before Apple started, he wrote one of his weekly columns for Next magazine, and he wrote over 1,500 columns during those years. He was in Paris with his wife, Teresa. She was pregnant with their first child. And the Chinese premier, a guy named Li Peng, was making his first state visit to the West, to democratic open societies, since the Tiananmen killings 5 years ago. And maybe if Jimmy had been in Hong Kong, he wouldn't have paid that much attention. But there was all this coverage about Li Peng, butcher of Beijing, going to Germany. He was so mad. He, hand wrote his column and faxed it off to the editor. And I talked to the guy who got it. And he's like, "We get this." It's like, what the heck? I mean, we cover Hong Kong. Why is the boss writing about China and Chinese premier? But what the heck? It's a free country. One country, two systems was supposed to be the guiding principle for when China came. Hong Kong would still have its freedoms. They ran the story. Well, they called Li Peng a bastard and lots of worse things, in fact. And Chinese authorities responded by shutting down. They went after one of his other businesses, a very profitable clothing company. Sorry, hope you can edit that out. They closed the Giordano store in Beijing. China had just opened up as a consumer market after centuries of foreign business people dreaming about the China market. China was at last open for business. All of a sudden, Giordano shut down in the capital city, right? Health violations, code violations, safety violations, the usual nonsense, right? The message is pretty clear: back off or we'll kill your business. So Jimmy, funnily enough, I happened to have dinner with him a couple of weeks later, and we spent the whole evening talking about it. And he resigned. I didn't know what he was going to do, but in fact, he resigned from the Giordano board, and the pressure continued. And he ended up selling his shares in Giordano, pocketed something like $200 million. Helped fund the media business. So, first of all, that's a huge turning point. I can't think of another businessman in China in the last 75 years who sold a thriving, profitable business with fantastic prospects and put his money into, a kind of marginal startup. And I think that, again, shows Jimmy's confidence, his belief, his principles. I mean, you asked before, like, why did he do this? I think he's somebody with real principles and real conviction and real passion. And so things were already sour. By the time of the handover, I was at an event he was at a few weeks before China took control. He broke down on stage. It was actually a session that was moderated by Al Newharth, who's the founder of USA Today. I think he ran something called the Freedom Forum then, and was a longtime head of Gannett. Jimmy started crying, said he thought he was going to jail after the handover, and you go, whoa. I mean, I remember that very vividly because, none of us knew what to expect when the Chinese were coming. And we all, kind of hoped for the best and feared the worst. And here was Jimmy saying he was ready to go to jail. And so I think he was always mindful of what the stakes were. In fact, he converted to Catholicism a week after the handover. And I think his wife said to me something like he knew trouble was coming and figured, a higher power might come in handy. I mean, he didn't mean that in a cynical or functional way. I think he meant it in a genuine way, and it really has been proved absolutely essential to grounding him now. But we go on, 2003, again, as I said, the opposition parties were structurally set up to be quite weak. Jimmy and his team rallied 500,000 people to turn out in the streets on July 1st, 2003, in opposition to a proposed national security law bill. And the clock kept ticking. He was spending more time in Taiwan during those years because Taiwan had just had its first, opposition party president. But in 2014, for the umbrella movement, Jimmy became personally more involved and really was on the front lines, and that was even truer in 2019, Summer of Democracy. So he was more than just a thorn in China's side. He was an example of a kind of person that the Chinese Communist Party just could not tolerate. And I think they decided they needed to get rid of him.
Can you just, for listeners who might not be familiar, give a quick summary of what the umbrella movement refers to?
Yeah, sorry to go over that so quickly.
No, you're
so, between 2003, this opposition to the national security law, to 2014, political tension was building. There was talk about democracy. The Chinese had promised that Hong Kong would have more democracy, that we'd move towards universal suffrage, which actually, in fact, only meant electing the city council and the mayor. But by Chinese standards, a really big deal. And the British had never managed to do it in 156 years. And the students were getting increasingly restive and unhappy. And they looked at Jimmy's generation and they're like, you guys have been at this for, 20, 30 years. You've been really polite, worked through the legal system, the legislative system, got nowhere. And so they took to the streets in 2014 in what became called the umbrella movement, because a number of people held up umbrellas in a vain effort to protect themselves against these volleys of tear gas, which were launched in really unprecedented escalation of violence by the police. And in the end, the students and Jimmy and others, many thousands of others, occupied 3 spots, one in central Hong Kong, just on the edge of the business district by the government headquarters, one in 2 others in busy shopping areas. They occupied these for 79 days. They had hundreds, thousands of tents set up, and Jimmy was one of those people who was there every single day. He had a tent. He sat in front of the tent, talked to anybody. He was just a normal guy. He wasn't up there on stage giving big speeches or anything. And that's also something interesting about Jimmy. He's China's most famous political prisoner, but he doesn't actually want political power. He's not like a Mandela or a Lech Wałęsa, name a South African or a Polish example. I mean, he just wants people to have a choice to vote for who they want, to be free, to have democracy. But he's not a political leader. He's a businessman. And so he was out there for those 79 days, and he was tear gassed. And at the end, he offered himself up for arrest, and he was arrested, although ultimately no charges were filed against him.
So that basically brings us to present day. In 2020, this really comes to a head when China passes that national security law, which under the guise of national security, but in effect targets dissent. Can you talk about why that law was passed and how it actually works in practice?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in 2019, we'd had the umbrella movement in 2014. Things have been simmering along, but increasingly, higher boil. They're more than just a simmer at this point, I think. And in 2019, the government tried to pass sounds a bit arcane, but it was an extradition law that would allow Hong Kongers to be sent to China to be tried in China. Now, given what we know about the justice system in China, of course, nobody, including the business community, wanted that. And so massive protests broke out. And the first weekend in June, there were 1 million people in the streets. The next weekend, there were 2 million. There were regularly 1 to 2 million, maybe more, people out in the streets. And this is in a city of 7.5 million people. And, given the restrictions, the continuing border restrictions between Hong Kong and mainland China, and also the fear of people in China, virtually none of those protesters were from China. So you have 2 million people, more than a quarter of the population. It would be as if 90 million Americans descended on Washington, D.C. And yet the government, in its, in its wisdom, refused to engage with any of the demands of the protesters, which were really drop the bill, drop the charges against us, release political prisoners, investigate the increasing police violence. Government just kept digging in and digging in and digging in. The police became more and more violent. Protesters, in turn, became more and more violent, at least when it came to vandalism and physical damage. It's arguable, but probably the police actually hurt more people physically than the demonstrators did. But anyway, it was not pleasant. I was there. It was not a nice time to be there. And things got more and more tense. And then, lo and behold, long scheduled district council elections, the lowest of the low elections of positions in Hong Kong, elected positions, at the end of November 2019. And there were something like almost 500 seats up for grabs. All the pro-Beijing people said, okay, now we'll see. The people will speak. The silent majority, they're sick of all this violence and turmoil. Overwhelming victory for the Democrats. About 6 out of 10 people voted for the pro-democracy people. Huge turnout. 71% of people voted. And again, these kind of rinky-dink, district council elections, but people wanted to send a message, and they did. And if it had been any kind of wise, let alone representative government, well, the government would have fallen, but there would at least be some kind of negotiation or some kind of attempt to deal with what people wanted, especially when you'd had this ballot box outcome. And instead, I think the lesson that the leader of China, General Secretary Xi Jinping, took away is we lost Hong Kong. We've got to kind of make it anew. And the way to do that is to send in some of the heaviest enforcers I know. And the next month after that election was the end of November. In December, he sent in a guy named Sha Baolong, a guy in his mid-60s, came out of retirement. His previous job had been one of Xi's chief enforcers. He'd literally been breaking up churches in Zhejiang province. There were a few, and he was put in charge of Hong Kong. And a few months later, it was June 30th by the time it came through, but the so-called National People's Congress in Beijing promulgated this national security law for Hong Kong. The head of Hong Kong, effectively the mayor, Carrie Lam, didn't even see the bill until earlier that day when it was put into practice. And yeah, essentially that outlaws dissent. And yeah, that's been used as a pretext along with COVID restrictions to, totally crush a free society in Hong Kong.
So, Lai is arrested in 2020. He's released and then rearrested, held without bond, and has been, as you said, jailed for about 1,500 days now. What exactly is he even accused of doing?
Billy, I ask myself that quite often. He's in a trial that's gone on about 140 days of actual courtroom hearings now. His technical crime is 2 counts of collusion with foreign forces and 1 of sedition. But I've listened to all the testimony in this voluminous prosecution case against him, and lots of smoke, but I'm still looking for the fire. The collusion primarily seems to be an attempt to conflate some meetings that he had with US politicians during the first Trump administration, July 2019, when all these demonstrations were happening. He met with Vice President Pence, Secretary of State Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton. That was a year before the national security law came into effect. But somehow, and although law is not supposed to be retroactive, they made a huge deal about all these meetings. He also may or may not have called for sanctions against Hong Kong officials who violated human rights, which, as I'm sure you know, the U.S. and other countries impose sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act and other acts to, punish human rights violators and make it so they can't buy apartments in the US and, travel here to visit their kids graduating from Harvard. And yeah, these are, mostly symbolic, but they're embarrassing and they sting. And they've been put on the Hong Kong chief executive, now a guy named John Lee, and he wasn't able to attend the APEC meeting in San Francisco in November 2023. And I think he was really humiliated and embarrassed by that. So they hate these sanctions. But I'm not really sure how that's collusion with foreign forces that's, kind of close to treason. So we go on and on and on. And it seems like what he's really guilty of is committing journalism and opposing the Chinese Communist Party. And it's really sad because Hong Kong's supposed to have free speech, and yet Jimmy's being tried because he's a troublemaker in his own words who doesn't like the Chinese Communist Party. And somehow the judges are conflating that with, you know, being anti-China. But that's kind of where it is. I'm sorry, it's a long answer because it's a really confusing case that, the lawyers his lawyers have filed for dismissal because it doesn't seem that the prosecution really has any case. But he will be found guilty. I mean, there's not a doubt about this.
My next question was actually, does he stand a chance? He does not stand a
Well,
chance.
there's a 97% conviction rate in the national security
And
law
he has no
case.
jury, correct?
There's no jury. So another interesting point. Good question, Billy. Hong Kong, before the Chinese took over, they promulgated a mini constitution to govern Hong Kong. It's called the Basic Law. All these freedoms are guaranteed there. Right to a jury trial. Somehow in the national security law, you don't actually have to have a jury. You wouldn't want the jury to feel afraid. Um, and so you have a secret panel of handpicked judges. And we know who the judges are. We don't know, they're from a secret panel. We don't know who's actually on that panel. And the judges in this case are acting like, the kind of prosecutors you'd see in a continental, like a French system or something. I mean, their judges are really acting as prosecutors. The prosecutors don't seem very good, actually. I think the judges are a bit frustrated by the whole situation. But I mean, it's at a level of total absurdity. So, no jury. He's also supposed to have the right under the basic law to have the lawyer of his choice, which in the past meant if you didn't find a lawyer you liked in Hong Kong and you wanted to find the best lawyer in the world and you had the money to do it, as Jimmy Lai does, you could get, let's say, Tim Owen, top barrister from the UK. He's practiced in Hong Kong, had a work visa for Hong Kong. The government lost 4 successive cases in all 3 levels of court in Hong Kong, and Jimmy had the right to have that lawyer. What did the government do? Being the sore losers that they are, they kicked it up to Beijing, asked Beijing to rewrite the rules so that they could keep Jimmy from having his own lawyer. So he doesn't have the best lawyer. I mean, he doesn't have the lawyer of his choice. We're not trying to cast any aspersions on his local lawyers, but people in Hong Kong are under an incredible amount of pressure. And it would be stretching credulity to imagine that a lawyer in Hong Kong is going to have the same freedom to act in court that, one who lives in the UK does. I mean, in China, we see lawyers being harassed and thrown into jail simply for defending their clients. And I think we're on the way to that in Hong Kong. So doesn't have the legal representation he wants, doesn't have a jury, doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell of being found innocent.
Do you have a feel for how people in Hong Kong generally perceive Jimmy Lai now? Are they still kind of on his side? Is it
Oh,
divided? What do
totally.
you think?
I actually think they're much more on his side than they were 5 years ago. 5 years ago, a lot of young people didn't like him because they saw him as way too moderate. This is another great irony. He's always preached nonviolence, and we can talk more about that. He's a deep commitment to nonviolence. As I said, he's a very devout Catholic. And a lot of young people just felt that, he wasn't radical enough. A lot of, older generation people thought that, Apple pushed things a little too hard with their support of the umbrella movement and of the protesters. So he was, I think, more of a polarizing figure. And now I think he's a real unifying figure. And, one of the examples I've seen of that is even, a very prominent pro-government paper, Oriental Daily News, has had some somewhat sympathetic stories about him recently. And this is a newspaper where, he and the newspaper's owners, had a very public, long-standing feud. So I think, even ODN and other publications recognize that their readers, the people of Hong Kong, are really on Jimmy's side.
Part of your book focuses on his prison life. I know most people assume prison is a pretty terrible place. But can you talk about, from your understanding, kind of what Lai experiences there on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I was lucky to get a number of letters which somehow made their way to me about at least his first couple of years in prison. And it's clear that he is trying to model the example of Natan Sharansky, the longtime Soviet refusenik who spent 9 years in the Soviet Gulag, who talked to him. I mean, I moderated a number of live stream recordings after the national security law came out, where Jimmy and I would talk to people like Sharansky or the last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patton, or the spiritual leader of Hong Kong, Cardinal Joseph Zen. Anyway, we had a fantastic, unbelievable conversation with Sharansky. I say we, I didn't really say anything. It was basically Jimmy peppering Sharansky. This was mid-November, I think, just a couple weeks before his bail was revoked and he was sent to prison. And so he knew he was going to prison. I didn't actually really even understand at that point how close it was. And it seemed so surreal, so unreal. And so and then I later talked to Sharansky about it, and he described some other conversations I'd had with Jimmy. And he said he'd never met anybody like Jimmy, knew he was going to prison. He could have left, by the way. As you said, rich man, houses in Kyoto and
And he has British
Taipei.
citizenship, so he could have gone to London or something.
Sorry, thank you. I should have mentioned that. Yes, he's a British citizen. He has an apartment in London's Mayfair district. He's got an apartment in Paris. I mean, he had lots of options, and he decided to stay. But he decided as with everything else in life, he wants to be the best that he can be. In this case, the best political prisoner he can be. So he reached out to Sharansky, or
Right.
maybe Sharansky reached out to him the first time. They had a number of conversations, and Sharansky talked about his experience. Again, think 9 years in the Soviet Gulag. I mean, no picnic.
Can't be pleasant.
And so Sharansky said, "Look, when I went into that prison, I realized that it wasn't up to me as to when I'd be physically free. That was up to my captors, to the KGB. But I could live as a free man, and that's what Jimmy's tried to do. And in the letters that I've seen, in the behavior that I've seen in court, in everything I hear from people who are able to talk to him, he is living as a free man within confines. I mean, probably the best way to think about it is what his godfather, Bill McGurn, describes as he's living the life of a Benedictine monk.
Who's
He's
at the
not
Wall
some
Street Journal,
wild-
right?
Sorry, what?
Bill McGurn is at the Wall Street Journal writer. Yes.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And he's not some wild-eyed prophet out in the desert. He's a guy who wakes up in his cell. He doesn't have a clock in there. He's in solitary confinement, which is where he's been for most of the last 4+ years. No clock, no natural light, no idea what time it is, no ability to turn the lights on. They go on when the guards want to turn them on. Doesn't choose, when to eat, let alone, of course, what to eat. Has to do forced prison labor, which in his case is making envelopes. And he spends as much of his time as he can reading, writing, praying, drawing. He's really an artist of, quite considerable skill. He's works solely on religious themes now. Reads a huge amount of theology, and that's what he's doing. And in prison, in court, he's more than held his own against the judges. He described himself as a political prisoner a week or so ago, and the judge tried to browbeat him into admitting that he was not a political prisoner. This was all just being done by the law. And they went back and forth a few times. It almost sounded like she was going to slap him with contempt of court. But what do you do when the guy's already in solitary? So, he just cut it off by just saying, continue, and smiled at the judge. I mean, he's able to, again, hold his own. He did this in a conversation the other day where he kept insisting that he was a Hong Konger. And the judge said, "No, you're Chinese." He said, "No, I'm a Hong Konger." And then the judge said, this is incredible. It gives you a sense of the Alice in Wonderland context to all this. The judge said, "Are you yellow?" He said, "Yeah, I'm Hong Konger, but are you yellow?" I mean, I'm not really sure what, but the judge, is a very, racially charged nationalist racial charge to the Chinese Communist Party's claim for legitimacy and control. And one of those things is pretty much everybody who looks ethnically Asian is one of us. And so you mentioned quite correctly, he's a British citizen. He's only had British citizenship. He hasn't traveled on mainland Chinese papers, as far as I can determine in my research, since he left Guangzhou for Macau on that one-way exit permit in 1961. Yet the Chinese refused to give the British diplomats consular access to him. So, look, he's living as freely as he can. It's tough. He's 77 years old. He had diabetes going in. I mentioned, losing a finger, having hearing loss, as a young, as an adolescent. Since he's gone into prison, he's had COVID, and he's had what seems to have botched cataract operation. So I think, and these are not nice conditions. I think summer is actually worse. We're concerned with summer coming. You can get 100% humidity days in Hong Kong, temperatures around 90 degrees, obviously, or not surprisingly, no air conditioning. You're sleeping on kind of a straw mattress. So, he's had quite bad heat rash and things. But, so physically, it's tough. Mentally, spiritually, he's living probably more freely than he's ever done. It's not to say he wants to be in there. He wants to be out. He wants to join his family. He wants to leave Hong Kong, but he's living as a free man as much as he can in these straitened circumstances.
Do you think he's somewhat at peace?
Oh, I think he's completely at peace. I think he'd like to be out, but if he spends the rest of his life,
It's hard for me to even wrap my head around that.
yeah, I think he's accepted it, and he has the serenity to accept what he can't change, and the courage, and conviction and energy to keep changing what he can. So, basically, what the communists seem to want, they want to convict him. They'd like to show that he's guilty. It's kind of hard when he's not cooperating. And what they typically do is browbeat people into pleading guilty. Um, he's I don't know how long he can survive, but he's giving as good as maybe better than he gets in terms of his encounters with the judges and the prosecutors at this point. So yeah, he wants to be out, but I think he's accepted that if he spends the rest of his life there, that's what God intends for him.
What is the sentencing like under this law? Is it possible that he dies in prison?
Oh, I think it's absolutely possible. It's a minimum 10-year sentence. He's basically public enemy number one. So this law was almost written for him. It can go up to a life sentence. Again, you're 77, you get a 10-year sentence. That's pretty close to a life sentence. And there's no for the national security law charges, no time off for good behavior or anything. So yeah, absent some kind of political deal, I think it's very likely that he'd end up in prison. But there's been a lot of movement in the last 6 months on, some kind of a negotiated solution. We're still a long way. I think until when the trial ends sometime this year, we'll be at the end of the beginning. And I think at that point, nothing to do with me, way, way, way above my pay grade. But I'd hope that diplomats and others in the Trump administration, in the UK government, and in the Chinese system in the Chinese Communist Party, and the PRC would, start trying to come to some kind of solution that would see him out, see some other prisoners out, see a real easing on Hong Kong.
Does he get to correspond with his family at all?
He's able to see his family 3 or 4 times a month for half an hour through plexiglass. There's some correspondence. Doesn't It seems like a lot of letters are not getting through, but some are. They're subject to a lot of censorship, of course. It's hard for them to really know how he's doing. He's not a guy who complains. I have seen them. I haven't talked to him about this, but I've seen that his son Sebastian, who lives in Taiwan, has been expressing increasing concerns about his father's health. I hope that doesn't, augur something, worse. But they're in court every day. And I mean, so the good news about Hong Kong is, unlike the mainland, you have an open court. You have a trial that's really gone on. I think it's a joke. We're not seeing any evidence at all, but we're seeing how what a paucity of evidence there is, in fact.
So I want to talk about you briefly. You worked at the South China Morning Post. You were the editor-in-chief.
Mhm.
How did you end up coming to work there, and what was that like?
Well, as I said, I moved to Hong Kong in 1992. I'd worked for a magazine owned by Dow Jones, the Far Eastern Economic Review, first in South Korea and then in Hong Kong.
And where are you
Moved
from
to
originally?
I'm from Massachusetts, but, went to university at Berkeley in California, and then was back in New York, did a fellowship, at Columbia, and moved to Asia. Completely accidental. I was not had no Asian background. I was a business and financial, journalist who was just really attracted by the, huge economic, changes taking place in Asia. So yeah, I worked for the Far Eastern Economic Review. I worked for Business Week. And then in 2003, 2004, I joined The Standard, which is one of 2 English language papers in Hong Kong. And I was I was publisher as well as editor-in-chief. Then I joined the South China Morning Post, and then I was the executive director of a group called the Asia Business Council, which was a group of about 75 CEOs and chairmen from all around Asia, from Saudi Arabia to Japan to Australia. So, I had a pretty wide range of experience in Hong Kong and throughout the region. And, having known Jimmy for those years, and once I'd left full-time job in media, I was asked to join the board of Next Digital. Ironically, I mean, of course, I supported their political orientation, but we really thought that our main focus was going to be making the transition from print to digital, which was happening quite slowly in Hong Kong, but which we did enormously successfully. I went on at the same time as a guy named Gordon Krovitz, who had been my boss earlier in Hong Kong and later went on to become the publisher of the Wall Street Journal. So we were really interested in the business side of things, and little did we know, the storm that was about to hit. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And then we were directors when the government froze our bank accounts, started investigating us, took us to court. I mean, honestly, it's a nightmare. And I don't know if even suffered is too strong a word, but I've borne the brunt of this state-sponsored onslaught against everything about Jimmy and his business and the media empire, in a kind of peripheral way as a director. And it is not nice when the state comes after you. And we were a publicly listed company on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And John Lee, a guy who was at the time Secretary of Security, decides he doesn't like us. He doesn't like Jimmy. First, he freezes a bunch of Jimmy's assets. Then he comes after us. He's got a letter. I think you might have broken the law, so I'm freezing your bank accounts. In other words, no court order, nothing. We're just shooting you and putting you out of existence. We couldn't wait almost 1,000 employees. We couldn't pay their paychecks. We petitioned John Lee, uh, you know, here's how much money we want to pay each person, their bank account, their ID number, nothing. The government sues us for not paying our employees. Honestly, I've mentioned this earlier. It's like Alice in Wonderland meets Kafka with George Orwell thrown in for good measure. I mean, you can't imagine how surreal it is and how disconcerting. And yet, this is a place that wants to pitch itself as a global financial center, and that's one of the messages of the book and of the work that I do in my day job running an NGO in Hong Kong. Is this place isn't it's not a trustworthy global financial center.
How did you come to leave Hong Kong?
Yeah, it was during COVID, and the national security law had come in, and people often use this metaphor about the frogs in the boiling water. They don't jump. Actually, it turns out frogs do jump. There have been a lot of studies on this, and frogs are actually smarter than people are, because I'm not sure I would have necessarily left, but a lot of people said to me, Mark, I didn't think I was doing anything out of the ordinary. I mean, Hong Kong's a free place, all these rights guaranteed in the basic law. And anyway, I decided to pack up. I thought, well, maybe I will have to leave in a hurry. So I'll just put a shipment together. I've been there for 28 years then, and put together a shipment of, some art, some books, furniture, just like heavy stuff. And then it was the end of, and that was just before, just as I was arranging all this, just as the national security law was coming in, and the shipment came, and I thought, well, it's COVID, you can't travel too much. I'll go get this stuff unpacked, and then I just bought a ticket back, and Jimmy's bail was revoked. My name was mentioned in conjunction with that. COVID restrictions started getting really tough. So honestly, if it hadn't been for the COVID restrictions, I probably would have said, Jimmy's in tough shape, but maybe I can support him. No reason, no danger for me. I don't know if there would have been danger for me or not. I do know that of my 8 colleagues, 2 of them have bounties by the Hong Kong government, which has offered rewards of close to $130,000 for each of them if they're successfully prosecuted in Hong Kong. And these are people who are doing, free speech work in the UK and in the US. So this is a nasty group of people masquerading, using the kind of bona fides that they've developed in 150 years of a British colony, and having a pretty good financial system, pretty good legal system. It's all being shattered. And back to that first question you answered, why should people care about Jimmy? Because Jimmy exemplifies all of this. He exemplifies how a guy like him, with nothing except his own talent, could prosper in a free place. First, it was just the freedom to eat, freedom to work, freedom to start his own business. Then, of course, it was the freedom through media, the freedom through his religion. And now it's the freedom that he finds in jail. I mean, it's all gone. And this is what I don't think that we've seen another city, absent a war, that's been this, ruthlessly destroyed in the last, 100 years or more. We just see civil liberties wiped out. And I do think that the Chinese Communist Party is a uniquely dangerous beast. And I think if we don't resist it in Hong Kong, however imperfectly, it makes it that much easier for them to go into Taiwan, after that to menace the Philippines and other places throughout Southeast Asia.
So there are a lot of debates right now about free speech abroad. Vice President J.D. Vance recently had a pretty viral speech where he spoke about free speech limitations in Europe. In February, CBS's Margaret Brennan made a claim that the Holocaust was in part able to happen because of free speech, which is a totally historically illiterate claim. I'm just wondering, as someone who's done this work for a really long time, what do you make of the state of free speech on a global scale? And how do you respond to people who aren't concerned about some of these slow moves in the other direction towards, maybe a more illiberal direction?
Yeah, I think it's concerning. I think if you look at any any of the kind of global studies that are done, the world has moved in a less free, more illiberal direction in the last 2 decades. And yeah, I think that's really concerning. And places like Taiwan, South Korea, places that have moved in more vibrant democratic directions are ones that we should really nurture. I think it's got to be troubling to anyone to see the kinds of restrictions on free speech that we've seen in, whether it's on campuses in the U.S. or in companies or in the government.
Yeah, and I think the typical response for people who might be a little skeptical, are that hate speech is bad. You know, I, how do you respond to that sort of that skepticism? That it's
Yeah,
okay, that certain speech is just too hateful to be allowed. And I mean, I don't think that anyone loves speech that is hateful. But how do you respond to that critique?
I mean, it's tough. I tend to be a free speech absolutist. Not everybody agrees with me. It's really painful when you hear people that you really disagree with saying horrible things, whether they're saying them about anyone, and I just think it's painful, but the alternative of shutting down free speech seems to me to be worse. I mean, I think if speech is peaceful, it should be protected. And I hope that can be the case in every country in the world.
Right.
Right now in Hong Kong, we have a situation where um, even a T-shirt that people don't like, that the government doesn't like, even facing backwards when the national anthem is being played. I mean, even the smallest examples of resistance are threatened with prison. I mean, I think that shows Hong Kong's dissent doesn't just show us the dangers of the Chinese Communist Party, but also the way in which liberal democracies, liberal societies can be shut down very quickly. And it's extremely worrying.
Mark Clifford, thank you for talking to Reason.
Thanks so much. Really enjoyed it.